Imagine walking through the elegant streets of Paris, London, or Berlin, surrounded by centuries of history, iconic architecture, and skyscrapers that reflect wealth, seemingly without limits. Now shift your imagination to the bustling streets of Dhaka, Kathmandu, or Yangon. These cities are alive with energy, culture, and hope, yet poverty and struggle remain impossible to ignore. How is it that two continents, each home to brilliant civilizations, massive populations, and centuries of human achievement, could end up so drastically different in terms of wealth and prosperity? Today, we are diving deep into this question, the shocking truth of why Europe became rich first, and why Asia, despite being home to more than 4.5 billion people, is still catching up in many areas. This isn't just a story about money, it's a story of history, geography, politics, and choices that shape the destiny of nations. By the end of this video, you'll uncover the hidden reasons, the overlooked factors, and the lessons that could very well shape our future. Segment 1. Geography and natural advantage. One of the earliest and most critical factors we need to consider is geography. Europe's temperate climate, fertile plains, and vast network of navigable rivers created the perfect conditions for agriculture, settlement, and long-distance trade. Crops could grow consistently, populations could stabilize, and trade routes could flourish across the continent. In contrast, much of Asia was shaped by geographical challenges. Unpredictable monsoons, scorching deserts, dense jungles, and towering mountain ranges. These natural barriers slowed internal trade, limited large-scale urbanization, and made economic integration far more difficult. Europe's rivers, such as the Rhine, Danube, and Thames, served as natural highways, carrying not only goods, but also ideas, technologies, and cultural exchange. Meanwhile, Asia's great rivers, the Ganges, Mekong, and Yangtze, were powerful but far less navigable, prone to flooding, and often isolating rather than connecting communities. This natural advantage gave Europe an economic head start, laying the groundwork upon which wealth and innovation could thrive. Segment 2. The Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution was nothing short of a turning point in human history. Beginning in the late 18th century, Europe experienced an explosion of technological progress. Steam engines, mechanized textile production, coal-powered factories, and eventually, railroads. These innovations transformed cities into hubs of production, created millions of new jobs, and generated levels of wealth previously unimaginable. Asia, however, was left behind during this crucial moment. While Japan rapidly industrialized during the Meiji Restoration, much of Asia was either under colonial rule, politically fragmented, or locked in traditional systems that resisted modernization. India, Southeast Asia, and large parts of China became suppliers of raw materials, cotton, tea, spices, and labor, rather than centers of industrial innovation. This created a massive wealth gap that took generations and, in some cases, centuries to even begin narrowing. Segment 3. Colonization and exploitation. Another undeniable factor behind Europe's wealth was colonization. European empires, including Britain, France, Spain, Portugal, and the Netherlands, controlled vast territories across Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Colonies supplied Europe with raw materials, cheap labor, and highly profitable trade routes, all of which poured wealth into European economies. Asia, despite its ancient civilizations and natural riches, was heavily exploited rather than developed. India, once one of the richest societies in the world, was transformed into a supplier of cotton, spices, and manpower for Britain. Indonesia's spices and rubber were drained for the Dutch. The Philippines enriched Spain. Local industries, education, and infrastructure were often deliberately suppressed, ensuring that European powers reaped the benefits while Asian societies were kept dependent and underdeveloped. Segment 4. Political fragmentation and instability. Europe's political environment, although competitive and often violent, ultimately encouraged innovation and state building. Rivalries between small but ambitious nations pushed leaders to improve governance, strengthen laws, support merchants, and invest in science and exploration. This competition created fertile ground for progress. Asia, by contrast, faced long periods of political fragmentation and instability. China endured dynastic collapses and foreign invasions. India was divided into hundreds of princely states. Southeast Asia was frequently embroiled in conflicts over borders and resources. Such instability made long-term investments, economic planning, and institutional development extremely difficult. And here lies a crucial truth. Political stability is essential for sustained economic growth. Europe enjoyed centuries of institutional strengthening, while Asia often struggled to maintain the foundations necessary for consistent prosperity. Segment 5. Culture, Education, and Scientific Innovation. Europe's rise to wealth wasn't only about armies and industries, it was also about ideas, education, and knowledge. The Renaissance in Italy, beginning in the 14th century, encouraged people to rediscover science, mathematics, art, and philosophy. This cultural rebirth led to the Enlightenment in the 17th and 18th centuries, a period that championed reason, experimentation, and intellectual freedom. European universities, Oxford, Cambridge, Bologna, Sorbonne, were not just centers of learning, they became engines of scientific and technological progress. The scientific revolution produced discoveries in physics, astronomy, medicine, and chemistry that directly fueled the Industrial Revolution. Steam engines, telescopes, microscopes, and the printing press all transformed society. Asia, in comparison, had its own deep traditions of knowledge. China's paper, gunpowder, and compass, India's mathematics and medicine, the Middle East's astronomy and philosophy, all were centuries ahead at one point. But these traditions were often interrupted or suppressed. Colonial powers discouraged higher education that could lead to resistance. Wars, foreign domination, and rigid bureaucratic systems slowed down the free exchange of new ideas. So, while Europe's societies encouraged curiosity, competition, and questioning, much of Asia was forced into stagnation during the very period when the world's economy was being reshaped. That cultural difference created an innovation gap that lasted for centuries. Segment 6. Globalization and the Modern Era. By the time globalization took off in the 20th century, Europe already had a head start. Its empires had secured colonies, trade routes, and financial systems that gave them enormous control. The Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, and global financial markets were largely built by Western powers to protect their economic influence. Asian nations, after centuries of colonization and wars, entered globalization on the back foot. Many countries only gained independence after World War II. Their economies were still dependent on raw materials, not finished goods. Their infrastructure lagged, their populations were often impoverished, and their industries were decades behind Europe. Yes, Asia began to rise after the 1960s and 70s. Japan's economic miracle, the four Asian tigers, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, and later China's explosive growth transformed the continent. By the early 21st century, Asia was producing more goods than Europe, becoming the world's factory floor. But wealth distribution remained uneven. Europe's centuries of accumulated capital, advanced infrastructure, and dominant financial systems meant that the average European remained far wealthier than the average Asian citizen. Globalization helped Asia recover, but Europe's historical, multi-century advantage continues to shape living standards even today. Segment 7. Technology, military power, and global influence. Another shocking truth about why Europe grew richer than Asia lies in its technological and military dominance. By the 16th century, Europe had mastered naval engineering and gunpowder-based weaponry. Small countries like Portugal and the Netherlands controlled global trade routes, not because they had the largest armies, but because they had the most advanced technology. Asia had larger empires and bigger populations, but many of them were slow to adapt to new military technology. For example, while the Ottoman Empire and Mughal India still relied heavily on traditional cavalry and fortresses, European powers had fleets of advanced warships, long-range cannons, and superior rifles. This gave Europe the ability to conquer and exploit regions many times their size. This dominance translated into economic control. Whoever controlled the seas controlled trade, and whoever controlled trade controlled wealth. Europe's dominance in technology allowed it to set the rules of global commerce. Meanwhile, Asia was often on the defensive. China fought the Opium Wars and lost. India fell under British rule, and Southeast Asia was carved up by colonial powers. Europe grew richer by exploiting not only Asia's resources, but also its delayed adoption of technology and military modernization. Section 8. The future. Will Asia overtake Europe? Here's the most fascinating part of this story. While Europe is still richer today, the future may belong to Asia. In the past 50 years, Asia has undergone one of the fastest economic transformation in human history. China has lifted over 800 million people out of poverty in just 4 decades. India is now the world's fastest growing major economy, with a booming tech sector. Southeast Asia is becoming a new hub of trade and manufacturing. Japan and South Korea are global leaders in technology and innovation. By population and economic size, Asia is already the center of gravity for the world economy. Yet, in terms of wealth per person, GDP per capita, Europe still holds the edge. The question is not whether Asia will rise. It already has. The question is how long it will take to close the gap completely. The future could see Asia surpass Europe in sheer economic power, but for now, Europe's centuries of accumulated wealth, institutions, and infrastructure give it an enduring advantage. So, how is Europe richer than Asia? The shocking truth is that it's not about intelligence, work ethic, or culture. It's about history, timing, and power. Europe had the right geography, the right institutions, the Industrial Revolution, and the brutal advantages of colonization. Asia, despite its brilliance and resources, was forced into a cycle of stagnation and exploitation during the exact centuries that determined global wealth. But today, the story is changing. Asia is rising, catching up, and in some areas, overtaking Europe. The next century could very well be the Asian century. And that, my friends, is the shocking truth behind the wealth gap between Europe and Asia. If you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell, because we'll be bringing you more eye-opening videos that reveal the hidden forces shaping our world.